On the 20th of July 2019, an ATR-42-500 from Pakistan International Airlines, operating Flight 605 from Islamabad to Gilgit, with 4 crew and 59 passengers, experienced a runway excursion after landing. Nobody was injured. Behind this somewhat trivial report is a story about overconfidence, lack of knowledge, and disrespect for standard operating procedures, SOP. Hello aviators, how are you today? My name is Magnar Nordahl. I'm an ATR captain and instructor. Some airports can be more challenging than others. One of the most demanding airports I have flown into is Ma Hong Son in Thailand. It's in a valley, and the runway is surrounded by hills and mountains. You land on runway 11 and you depart in the opposite direction. Ma Hong Son is located near the border between Thailand and Myanmar. And at the time I was flying there, the only instrument approach was a VOR-DME approach to runway 11 via a 4-DME arc. Adding to the difficulty, the runway slopes uphill, creating an optical illusion that can make you feel too high on final approach. And to make it even more complicated, somewhere on the final there is a point of no return, and from there you are committed to land. Ma Hong Son is also the hottest place in Thailand. The highest temperature recorded was 44.6 degrees Celsius. And this heat affects the performance of the aircraft. For this reason, every time we did training in the simulator, we practiced the procedures at this airport. Now let's have a look at another airport that is also a challenge, Gilgit in Pakistan. Gilgit Airport has an elevation of nearly 4,800 feet. It is in a valley surrounded by mountains exceeding 20,000 feet. The runway is 5,400 feet long, or 1,645 meters. At the day of the incident, the temperature was 26 degrees Celsius, which is 20 degrees above standard. And this resulted in a density altitude of 7,480 feet. And this means the air is much thinner than at sea level, and this has 2 consequences for the aircraft. The engine produces less power than normal, so your climb performance is reduced. And because the air molecules in thin air are further apart than in dense air when it's cold and you're at low altitudes, the aircraft will travel much faster than the speed indicated on your airspeed indicator. Remember that. Because Gilgit Airport has a high elevation and because it's located in a mountain valley, the operator, Pakistan International Airlines, have developed special procedures for this airport. You must follow visual flight rules, VFR, and during descent, the max speed is 200 knots. When passing Boji, the speed shall be reduced to 180 knots. And the configuration for landing should begin after Siglar Valley. In ATR-42, the maximum speeds for flaps extension are flap 15, 180 knots, flap 25, 160 knots, flap 35, 150 knots. The maximum speed for landing gear extension is 170 knots. The company procedure is to keep a 5 knots margin. So at 175, you can set flap 15, 165 knots, you can set the landing gear down at 155 knots, flaps 25, and 145 knots, flaps 35. The aircraft should be fully configured and the checklist complete before passing 3 miles from the threshold. That's a point called Broken Bridge. When flying a straight-in approach with a constant 3-degree slope, ATR recommends the following procedure. You can maintain 240 knots until 13 nautical miles from the runway threshold. Then you select flight idle. When passing 8 nautical miles from the threshold, the speed should be 170 knots and you can start configuring the aircraft. And you will be fully stabilized before passing 1,000 feet. Stabilized means that you are in full landing configuration, gear down, full flaps. you have set the power to normal power for approach. In ATR about 22% plus or minus depending on the slope and the wind. And you are on the extended center line and on the correct glide path. Your speed should not exceed the approach speed plus 10 knots. And of course the before landing checklist is completed. Some airline companies allows you to be stabilized at 500 feet if you are in visual meteorological conditions. And if you're not stabilized, you go around. The crew consisted of an experienced captain and instructor and a first officer. The captain was pilot flying. He had a total of almost 8,000 hours, whereof 1,210 hours on the ATR. The first officer was pilot monitoring. He had a total of 757 hours, and on the ATR he had 557 hours. Again, we have an accident involving an experienced instructor and a new first officer. And in every case I have covered so far, you will find link to some videos here. It was the captain who messed it up. The final report was released 4th of July 2024, 5 years after the accident. The aircraft took off from Islamabad at 0702 local time. The takeoff weight was 18,600 kilos, which means it was at maximum takeoff weight. After takeoff, they engaged autopilot. When the aircraft climbed through 1900 feet radio altimeter, vertical speed mode was engaged. That is not normal, you should never do that. For climb, we always use indicated airspeed, and for ATR 42, the standard climb speed is 160 knots. We can also reduce the speed a bit to what we call a white bug plus 10 knots. But vertical speed, never, except for one thing. If you have a high rate of climb and you're about to level off at the assigned altitude, you can select vertical speed to 1000 feet per minute to avoid any TCAS issues if there is traffic nearby. The vertical speed target was initially set at 400 feet per minute, which was increased to 1700 feet per minute and then to 2000 feet per minute. This resulted in pitch angle increasing to 15 degrees and the speed reduced to 130 knots before the speed was increased again. 130 knots is 5 knots below minimum operating speed, which is marked with the white bug. So this was clearly a breach of normal procedures. And as the report stated, this indicated a cautious approach by the captain, showing a disregard for the procedures, and I totally agree. Gilgit Airport reported good weather with zero wind, 9 kilometers visibility, no clouds, and as I said before, 26 degrees Celsius. At 0736, the captain initiated the descent, and the speed increased to 245 knots, which was above the requirement of 200 knots set in the standard operating procedure. And the first officer rightfully told the captain he was flying too fast. But the captain ignored the first officer and did nothing to reduce the speed. A cornerstone in flight safety is what we call crew resource management. That means we pilot can talk together. The point is that we can inform each other what we're planning to do, and we can also inform the other pilot, the flying pilot, if the pilot exceeds any limitations or deviate from the standard procedure. But because the captain failed to respond to the first officer, and because of the high authority gradient in the cockpit, the first officer didn't speak up at all for the rest of the flight. I cannot blame him for it. The main reason for why the procedure called for a descent speed of maximum 200 knots and later 180 is the high terrain surrounding the valley. The aircraft is equipped with an enhanced ground proximity warning system. The system includes a terrain database that will trigger an alert when there is high terrain 55 seconds ahead of the aircraft. When the aircraft was 10 nautical miles from the runway, the enhanced ground proximity warning system triggered an alert for 17 seconds. If the aircraft had been flying at correct speed, 180 knots instead of 245, this alert could have been avoided. The aircraft leveled off at 2,000 feet above the ground level with the autopilot engaged. The power levers were retarded to flight idle, where they remain until touchdown. The speed gradually decreased down to 200 knots, but at this point they should have been at 170 so they could start configuring the aircraft. The captain disengaged autopilot and the aircraft started to descend. As the aircraft was crossing 700 feet above the ground, the condition levers were set to 100% override. This will increase the drag and therefore reduce the speed, but this was too little, too late. During the approach, they had a tailwind of 10 to 19 knots, which reduced to less than 5 knots tailwind on landing. The captain asked for the first officer's opinion to make a 360-degree circle to reduce the speed. But the first officer hesitated because he felt the captain had experience he should know, right? And because of what happened earlier during descent, where the captain didn't respond to his call, the first officer remained silent. And the captain didn't notice the hesitation from the first officer, so the captain just continued the approach. According to the SOP of the company and every other companies, the aircraft must be in landing configuration and stabilized minimum 3 nautical miles before the runway. That means you're at 1,000 feet above the runway, and that is a point they call a broken bridge. However, because of the high speed, the aircraft could not be configured for landing yet. And to make it even harder for the captain steered directly towards the runway instead of turning off for a base and then to final. The ground proximity warning system gives alerts when the aircraft is flying at a high speed below 1,000 feet above the terrain, when the landing gear is not down below 500 feet, and when the landing flaps is not set below 250 feet. At 513 feet, the too low terrain warnings only for 6 seconds.
Too low, terrain.
Followed by too low gear 2 times.
Too low, gear.
Followed by too low terrain, and finally too low flaps.
Too low, flaps.
Despite the warnings, the captain made no attempt to abort the approach and make a missed approach. Neither did the first officer call for a missed approach. As the aircraft continued to descend towards the runway, the flaps was selected to 15 at 491 feet above the ground. The speed was 180 knots. And shortly after, at 174 knots, they selected gear down. That was 4 knots above the gear down speed. The flaps came down to 15 degrees position at 257 feet above the ground, whereas the landing gear were down and locked at an altitude of 50 feet above the ground, at a speed of 162 knots. Those images are from the surveillance camera at the airport. Here, the aircraft passes the 1,000 feet marker, where they should have touched down. Instead, the aircraft touched down at the 2,000 feet marker, or 610 meters past the threshold. The indicated airspeed was 150 knots. And do you remember what I said about the thin air? This resulted in a true airspeed of 168 knots. And with 2 knots tailwind, the speed over the ground speed was 170 knots. The remaining runway distance was now 3,400 feet or 1,035 meters. After touchdown, the captain applied the brakes but did not use the reverse. The aircraft was not able to stop in time. And do you know why? It's all about energy. This is the formula for kinetic energy. And you can see that the energy depends on the square of the speed. The report doesn't give us the landing weight, but since they departed with maximum weight and flew for 45 minutes, I assume their weight was close to 18,100 kilos. With that weight and flaps 35, the speed would have been 104 knots. And when you compensate for the density altitude, the true airspeed would be 116 knots. We had 2 knots tailwind and the ground speed would be 118 knots. That is 61 meters per second. But instead the ground speed was 52 knots more, 170 or 87 meters per second. So when we now put in the formula here, 61 meters per second squared multiplied with the weight, multiplied by half, we get an energy of 33.7 megajoule. The actual landing speed was 87 meters per second, and when we put that into the formula, we will get an energy of 68.5 megajoule. That is more than double of what it should have been. And this is why the captain was not able to stop the aircraft in time. The report didn't discuss brake overheat, but that was a possibility, absolute. When the aircraft now approached the end of the runway, the speed was 75 knots. And the captain now faced 2 options. Plan A was to continue straight through a fence and onto a road. The captain selected Plan B and steered the aircraft to the right and then attempted to turn the aircraft to the left while increasing power on the right engine. The aircraft skidded sideways and off the runway end. The right main landing gear collapsed and the right propeller and wingtip hit the ground. After the aircraft came to a stop, the captain shut on the engines and instructed the cabin crew to maintain stations. The captain felt that immediate evacuation was not required. There was no fire. All passengers later disembarked safely. The aircraft suffered considerable structural damage and the company decided to write it off. The accident report concluded that the accident happened because of intentional high-speed approach and landing by pilot flying, failure to adhere to SOP, standard operating procedures, and lack of situation awareness and anticipation, resulting in inadequate decision-making. Contributing factors: lack of assertiveness by pilot monitoring, and inadequate application of crew resource management, CRM. But the report did not blame the crew alone. It also states that the Pakistan CIA, Civil Aviation Authority, and the company also failed. On paper, the company had a flight data analysis program. When used correctly, you can identify trends. For example, pilots tend to fly a bit fast on approach, or they are configured and stabilized a bit late. And then they can take measures before this develops into something more serious. But this program was not followed. The company's safety department did not even have a dedicated flight data analyst until after this accident. To the investigators, the company stated that there were no preceding occasions which had required the captain to be debriefed regarding violation of procedures or parameters. So therefore no warnings had been given. But the investigation revealed that the captain had a habit of flying high speed on approach and even on landings many times. And this had no consequences for the captain, and therefore the captain continued doing this. The report also revealed deficiencies in the training of the pilots. Normally, you will train a go-around or missed approach in a simulator, and this is very often a generic experience where you have a lot of space and no high terrain around you. So this is what the training the pilots received, the standard go-around procedure. But they didn't receive proper simulator training for performing a go-around at airports like Gilgit, where you have very small space, so, and also high density altitude. And this is a very different game. And interviews with the pilots also reveal they have a very poor understanding of basic aerodynamics. For example, they could not explain the relation between indicated airspeed, calibrated airspeed, true airspeed, and ground speed. And this is basic, what you learn for your PPL. A lot can be said about those basic knowledge, but that can be a topic for another video. If you like what I am doing, please considering becoming a member. By doing that, you support my work. Thank you so much to all of you already supporting me. And one of the perks you will receive is that you will see the videos 2 days before the others. And during those 2 days, there are no advertisements. Okay, that's all. Thank you for watching. Have a wonderful day and happy landing.